Today we have some more actual history about two Indians who were called good because they desired peace with the American settlers. The first is Little Carpenter, or Attakullakulla, of the Cherokee tribe. He was prominent during the French and Indian War, where he tried to persuade his fellow Cherokees to side with the British colonists and not with the French. The second Indian chief we'll hear about is White Eyes of the Delaware or Lenape tribe. He rose to power around the time of the United States Revolution, and he made great efforts to maintain neutrality in the war, and persuade his tribesmen not to side with the British. We will be reading from this book, True Stories of the American Indians. This book was published all the way back in 1905 by Edward Sylvester Ellis. This book contains several short stories which cover the lives of the most prominent Native Americans who had lived up to that time. So here first is the story of the Cherokee chief Attakullakulla. It is titled, A Good Indian, Little Carpenter, the Cherokee. It is unfortunate that the amicable relations of William Penn and the Indians could not have been more lasting and more widespread. Often the latter, with their savage instincts, were to blame for the feeling of hatred existing, but on the other hand, many a red man has set a noble example to those who oppressed him. Such an Indian was Attakullakulla, a name so hard to pronounce that we shall use the one by which he was known among the whites. This is Little Carpenter, who was a Cherokee chief born early in the 18th century. Like White Eyes, of whom we have told, he was always opposed by a war party, at whose head was a Conestoga, or the Great Warrior. The Cherokees made a treaty with the English in 1730, and were their friends for a quarter of a century. Then, on the eve of the great struggle between England and France for the ownership of America, French agents succeeded in causing a division of feeling among the Cherokees. English messengers strove to win them to their side, and a grand council was called by the tribe to decide what they should do. Everything was going in favor of the English, when the council was thrown into a wild rage by the news that a party of their tribe, which had visited the French on the Ohio, had been massacred by Virginians while on their way back. So fierce was the anger of the Cherokee members of the council that they would have killed every English agent present but for Little Carpenter, who managed to save them with great difficulty after an exciting harangue. The Cherokees had given much help to the English expedition against Fort Duquesne, but on their return when the worn horses gave out, they left some of them by the wayside on the frontiers of Virginia, and took others that belonged to the people whose homes they were passing. This brought an attack upon them, in which 20 warriors were shot down. This crime was partly due to the fact that after Braddock's massacre, Virginia offered a bounty for Indian scalps. Thus the white men were impelled by two powerful motives: indignation over the theft of their property, and an avarice that did not stop at the call of mercy. It proved to be the sowing of the wind and the reaping of the whirlwind. Little Carpenter would not have been an Indian had not his soul been stirred by this fearful crime. After he had warned the agents of their danger and safely hidden them, he turned to his warriors, his whole frame shaking with anger. "Let us make war at once," he said, "and never bury the hatchet till our countrymen have been avenged. We cannot violate our faith or the laws of hospitality by staining our hands with the blood of those now in our power. They came to us as brothers, and have no blame for what evil men have done. Let them carry back the belts of wampum, and then let us take up the hatchets, and not rest until all these murderers have been destroyed." The man hated above all others by Great Warrior and the Cherokees was Captain Coitmore. He was the commandant at Fort George, who had placed the irons prisoners in their wretched quarters, and treated them with brutality. The continued confinement of the hostages enraged the Indians, who laid siege to Fort George. It did not take Great Warrior long to learn he could make no impression on it, and he gave up his design for another, more subtle one. He hid a number of his bucks in a dense canebrake at the riverside, and sent a squaw, who was well known at the garrison, to the captain, with a request that he would come to the water where the chief was waiting to tell him important news. Captain Coitmore was rash enough to accept the invitation, and went to the place named with 2 of his officers as companions. He soon saw Great Warrior standing on the other side of the savannah, with a bridle in his hand. This was to give color to his statement that he was going to Charleston to secure the release of the Cherokees held as hostages. As the distance was great, he hoped to be able to obtain a horse. As he said this, the chief turned about and swung the bridle over his head. The act was the signal to the hidden men, who instantly fired at the 3 officers. The captain was killed and his companions wounded. The garrison immediately started to put all the hostages in irons, they having been released a short time before. They resisted fiercely, killing one of the soldiers and wounding several. The prisoners expected their comrades outside to come to their help, but that was beyond their power, and the troops completed their crime by putting every one of the imprisoned hostages remorselessly to death. By a strange fatality, the victims were related to nearly all the principal families among the Cherokees, who were driven to a frenzy against the whites. Great Warrior became as determined in his hostility as ever Pontiac or Philip, while Little Carpenter, as grieved and angry as he, still saw that a war would only add to the sufferings of his people. He strove to keep them from taking the war path, but it was in vain. He stood almost alone. The scenes that followed were such as have spread woe and desolation times without number along the frontier. The truth was driven home at last upon the Cherokees that the only way of escaping destruction was left to them. That was to make peace with the whites on the best terms they could get. When the force reached Fort George, 20 chiefs begged a meeting with the colonel. The proud Great Warrior was not with them, for he would have died before asking mercy of the invaders. But Little Carpenter was at the head of the party. He was known to the commandant, who received him and his companions with fitting honors, and accepted the statement that he spoke for his whole people. Addressing the officer, Little Carpenter said, "You live at the waterside and are in light. We are in darkness, but hope that all will yet be clear. I have been going about all the time doing good, and though I am tired, yet I come to see what can be done for my people, who are in great distress." At this point, the chief handed over the belts of wampum, which he had brought from the different towns as prayers for peace. "As to what has happened," continued Little Carpenter, "I believe it has been ordered by our Father above. We are of a different color from the white people, but one God is the Father of us all, and we hope what is past will be forgotten. God made all people. There is not a day that some are not coming into and others going out of the world. The great king told me the path should never be crooked, but open for everyone to pass and repass. As we all live in one land, I hope we shall all love as one people." Anxious as the Cherokees were for peace, and strongly as Little Carpenter had striven from the first to bring it about, it must not be thought that he was lacking in personal or moral courage. None but the bravest of men would have dared to withstand the terrible Great Warrior and the large majority of his tribe, as this chief did again and again. So at the present time, when the English leader of the expedition stated terms on which he would give peace to the Indians, Little Carpenter rejected one condition. That was the surrender of 4 Cherokees, specially noted for their cruelties, and their execution in front of the camp. The chief closed his lips and shook his head. The colonel persisted. It was the only condition over which there was any hitch. "I will insist," continued the officer. "Take a day and think it over. You and all your people have asked for peace. These 4 men deserve death, and you ought not to let a little matter like that stand in the way." On the day following, the colonel asked Little Carpenter for his decision. "I gave it yesterday," he replied. The officer was vexed at what he considered the stubbornness of the chief, and refused to yield to him. The most to which he could consent was that Little Carpenter should make the long journey to Charleston, and lay the matter before the governor. Little Carpenter traveled the hundreds of miles through wilderness and solitudes, and explained his errand to the governor. By this time, South Carolina had an executive of sense. He knew all about Little Carpenter. He considered him the finest type of his race, whose conduct from the first was highly honorable. He had never been known to ask an unreasonable thing, and the governor no sooner understood what he wished than he assured him it should be granted. Then Little Carpenter made another request. "We wish that Captain John Stewart shall be made Indian agent in our nation. All the Indians love him, and none of us will ever feel uneasiness while he is with us." "It shall be as you wish," replied the governor, and the pleased chief, having obtained all and indeed more than he expected to obtain, arose to set out on the long journey homeward through the wilds. So that is the end of the story of Little Carpenter, or Attakullakulla, from this 1905 book by Edward Sylvester Ellis. We will probably be reading a much longer account of Attakullakulla's life in a future episode on this channel that gives many more details about the war between the Cherokees and the whites in South Carolina. We will now read the story just mentioned in this story of Delaware Chief White Eyes. This is from the same book. This chapter is titled, A Man of Mark Among the Delawares, Tammany, White Eyes, and Captain Pipe. Tammany was the most famous of the Delaware Indian chiefs. He died toward the close of the 18th century. His reputation is that of a mighty warrior, a lofty patriot, and the greatest statesman ever born among his people. Such were his perfections that his countrymen believed he talked with the Great Spirit. In 1776, when Colonel George Morgan of Princeton, New Jersey, was sent to the Western Indians by Congress, he was so liked by the Delawares that they called him Tammany, in honor and remembrance of their ancient chief, and as the greatest mark of respect which they could show to that gentleman, who they said had the same address, affability, and meekness as their honored chief. When the first whites visited this country, the Lenape or Delaware Indians, one of the most important members of the Algonquin family, occupied the valleys of Delaware and Schuylkill. They were so powerful that they impressed themselves on the tribes from the Hudson to the Chesapeake. This power lasted till the rise of the Iroquois, or Six Nations of New York, the greatest confederation that ever existed among the American race. It soon crushed the Delawares, who lost in a sense their independence. At an assemblage near Lancaster in 1774, the Iroquois forbade the Delawares to sell their lands without the permission of their masters, who even called them squaws, and looked upon them with undisguised contempt. About the middle of the 18th century, the Delawares removed to the banks of the Susquehanna. They learned the principles of non-resistance from William Penn and the missionary Zinzendorf, for which they suffered much at the hands of the English and the Iroquois. The former charged that they were under the French influence, while the Iroquois, angered at their neutrality, despoiled them without mercy and expressed contempt for the tribe. The Delawares produced two remarkable chiefs of opposing views. One wanted peace, and the other wished war. Each had hundreds of friends, and the tribe was broken up by quarrels, which often resulted in bloodshed. The leader of the peace party had a hard Indian name, but was dubbed Captain White Eyes by the Americans. Whether this was due to any peculiarity of his organs of vision, we have not been able to learn. It may have been on account of his peace principles, which were as open as those of the Friends. He was the leading chief of the Turtle clan in Ohio, and his bitterest enemies never denied his lofty honor, pure life, and unselfish patriotism. When the Revolution broke out, the British authorities used every effort to win the Delawares over to their side. Congress strove equally hard to hold them neutral. Thus, two opposing factions faced each other. White Eyes was the sleepless champion of peace, and Captain Pipe of war to the knife. Both had ingenuity, tact, and strong will. Captain Pipe, on his part, could count upon the natural, revengeful temper of his countrymen. They had many wrongs to brood over, and the Indian dearly loves war. White Eyes admitted the wrongs his people had suffered, but insisted that the true interests of the Delawares forbade them to take the side of either of the opponents. If they did, they were sure to suffer, and many of their bravest men would be slain. There was no difference between the British and Americans. One was as likely to prove as good or ill a neighbor as the other. It followed that the Delawares, in breaking apart, joined one or the other of the warring champions. They lost sight of the principles at stake, and identified themselves with the leaders. The Delaware tribe had passed under the sway of two great sachems or bosses. Which was to prevail? White Eyes gave many proofs of his personal courage. When war became certain, he and several of his tribe went to Pittsburgh to meet in conference with a number of Senecas, members of the Iroquois or Six Nations, and resolute allies of the British. White Eyes boldly opposed their designs, and used such biting words that the Senecas were angered. They told him he was the last one to prate of independent actions by his tribe, when everyone knew that they had been made women by the Iroquois. White Eyes scornfully faced the chief who uttered this insult, and replied, "I know you look upon us as a conquered nation, as your inferiors, as women made such by you. You say you have placed hoes in our hands, and ordered us to dig and plant for you, and that we shall wear petticoats. But look at me. Am I not a full-grown man? Am I not in the dress of a warrior? Do I not carry a musket the same as you? And, waving his hand toward the Allegheny, all that is mine. These were daring words, and greatly disturbed many of his own warriors, who believed the fiery Senecas would revenge themselves upon White Eyes and his friends. They sent word to the Iroquois that they did not think like White Eyes, and that they would not stay by his side. Captain Pipe had much to do with this cowardly action. He and White Eyes set to work with more resolution than ever, and each had varying success. White Eyes' message to the Wyandots at Sandusky was insultingly answered by notice to the Delawares to hold themselves ready to take the warpath with them against the Americans. He visited a portion of the same tribe at Detroit. They refused to receive his peace belts except in the presence of the British governor. When the proffer was made before him, he snatched the belts from the hands of the chief, cut them to pieces, and threw them to the ground in a high rage. And you, he said, turning angrily upon White Eyes, if you value your life, will leave here within half an hour. This remarkable man was often in imminent peril from his own people. Passion ran high, and among the friends of Captain Pipe were many who would have assassinated White Eyes, had they not lacked the courage. It is hard to understand how he escaped, and how he retained his influence over so many fiery warriors. Early in 1778, a number of Tories from Pittsburgh came among the Indians with word that the Americans were hurrying against them, and their only hope of escape was to begin war without delay. These rumors threw the Delawares into a panic, and for several days White Eyes could do nothing to stay the rising tide. When he was able to soothe them to some extent, he called a council to which he said he was satisfied that the reports were lies, and it would never do for his warriors to make a mistake in such a matter. He, therefore, asked them to do nothing for 10 days. This would give time to learn the facts. The cunning Pipe also called a council. He gave out the impression that he knew the whole truth, and he called upon his countrymen to declare that man an enemy to the nation, who did anything to prevent their taking up arms against the American people. White Eyes parried this blow by saying that if the Delawares were determined to go upon the warpath, he would go with them. I have done what I could for peace, he said, but if you choose to believe these lying vagabonds, you shall not go without me, and I shall not follow. I shall place myself at your head, and none shall fight harder than I. I shall be the first to fall, for I do not wish to survive my nation. I will not live to mourn the destruction of a people who deserved a better fate. This appeal was overpowering. The council, with more enthusiasm than such a body generally shows, declared that they would wait the 10 days, while others said with equal emphasis that they would never fight the Americans unless led by White Eyes. The baffled Pipe and his friends worked more determinedly than ever, and with such success that after several days, many of the Delawares began preparations for war. White Eyes was warned that if he interfered again, he would be killed. 9 days had passed without a single fact appearing to disprove the rumors of the coming of the Americans. It looked as if nothing could calm the rising war spirit. Providentially, at this juncture, the German missionary Heckewelder, who had arrived among the Christian Delawares not far from the village of White Eyes, learned of the crisis, and made haste to the settlement. His coming drew wide attention, and the warriors flocked thither from all points, anxious to learn the errand that had brought the white man thither. The missionary and White Eyes had always been friends, but the chief now scowled at him, and refused to take his offered hand. Heckewelder was amazed, but quickly read the meaning of this rebuff. Pipe had his spies in the crowd watching everything. If White Eyes welcomed the missionary, it would show that he had been invited to come, and that the whole affair was a scheme to throw dust in the eyes of the Delawares. If the chief sowed a distrust, it would tell the contrary story. Heckewelder demanded the reason of the chief's churlish action. He answered, I will tell you. If what has been told us is true, I have not a single friend among the Americans. Therefore we are the enemies of every white man, and can look upon you as coming to us only to put us off our guard, that our enemies may take us by surprise. Heckewelder strongly denied the charge, declaring that if he was not the friend of the Delawares, he never would have come among them. White Eyes fixed his piercing gaze upon the missionary, and in the hush that fell upon the throng, asked, Will you tell me the truth as to what I shall ask you? I always strive to speak the truth, and I shall not deceive you, was the reply. We are told that the American armies have been cut to pieces, that General Washington has been killed, that there is no more Congress, and that those that have not already been hanged will be taken to England and hanged by the king, that all the country beyond the mountains is in possession of the English, and the few thousand Americans who have escaped are gathered on this side of the mountains to kill us and our women and children. Now tell me the truth. Are all or any of these things true?" With all the solemnity he could command, the visitor replied that there was not a word of truth in the rumors that had been brought to the Delawares. The Americans had not been defeated. Washington was unharmed. The cause of patriotism was making the best of progress, and he carried with him the proof that one of the greatest of the British armies had surrendered to the Americans only a few months before. Heckewelder then unfolded and displayed a newspaper which told of the capture of General Burgoyne and his troops. Then the visitor added that he had with him also the friendly messages which the Americans wished him to deliver to the Delawares as a sign of their goodwill. Every warrior present knew that the visitor was a man of truth, and his words caused a sensation. White Eyes seized the psychological moment, and turning to the assemblage, asked whether they should listen to the words of those who had always been their friends. The warriors replied as one voice that they would. Accordingly the drum was beaten, and the whole body moved to the council house, where friendly addresses were spoken. When they were finished, White Eyes stepped forward and offered his hand to Heckewelder, saying, "You are welcome, my brother," and the others did likewise. It was a triumph. Captain Pipe was silent, and soon after his spies brought him word that everything told by the white men was true. White Eyes sent his runners to the Shawnees, where the Tories had already gone to stir up enmity against the Americans, and the messengers did their work well. Never was a more complete victory gained by diplomat, statesman, or military leader. Ever anxious for peace, White Eyes made a visit to Pittsburgh in the winter of 1779 and 80 to talk with the Indian agent. He went with General McIntosh to the country of the Tuscaroras, where a fort was to be built for the protection of the neutral Indians, but, sad to say, he took the smallpox and died. The death of the great and good chief caused profound grief, not only among the Delawares, but with other tribes. One of the truest friends the American Indians ever knew had gone to his final hunting grounds. White Eyes now being out of the way, Captain Pipe naturally gained control of his people. He fought on the side of the British, and at times showed a high sense of honor and chivalry. He is believed to have died about the year 1820. So that's it for this episode on two friendly Indians who played prominent roles in the period between the French and Indian War and the United States Revolution. This episode is dedicated to a couple viewers who have commented on prior videos, asking for a story that is not so grim, and doesn't have so much murdering and scalping. Hopefully these two stories fulfill that request to some extent. The second story talked briefly of the Delaware Chief Tammany, who lived in the 17th century, and was very influential in establishing peaceful relations with William Penn and the early settlers of Pennsylvania. This peace seemed to last from the late 1600s until the beginning of the French and Indian War, around 1754. Chief Tammany was honored and revered by the Founding Fathers as the Patron Saint of America during the Revolution. Tammany Hall is named after him. Chief Tammany was also who the logo of the Washington Redskins football team was based on, until the logo was discarded due to public pressure a few years ago. This book, True Stories of the American Indians, is a good choice for anyone looking for a brief introduction to most of the major Indian chiefs from the time of Powhatan and Pocahontas, all the way to Geronimo and Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. We did a few stories from this book on the Powhatan Indians and their attacks on Jamestown that I will provide links to in the comments. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has now been deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. Here on this channel, our goal is to keep this worthy history of our ancestors alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support our mission here at this channel, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.